Okay. And I'd like to state that it is May 23rd of 2016, and we are visiting with Verlin, aka Tony, and Elaine Verana of Seward, Nebraska today. And I hope you don't mind, folks, but I'm always so bold. I ask our ages because I think it's so cool. This is a wonderful thing. Elaine, do you mind?
No, I'm 85, going on 86 in September.
Fantastic. And Tony?
And I am 90 on
right.
June 25th.
That's right, a good day. If
That
it ever
is,
was.
we share a birthday.
I'll be 91.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I kind of like to go through because I think it's important that these next generations learn what it was like or hear what it was like. So some of these questions are very, very simple. And so I like to document, where were you born, Elaine?
I was born on a farm out here northeast of Seward, where my folks moved on there in 1919 and lived there till 1965. And I was born and raised there and didn't move off till I moved with Tony.
Wonderful. And where were your parents from? What lineage?
My paternal parents was my dad, whose parents came from Norfolk, England, and he came over when it was the Industrial Revolution over in England, and came to a farm here, and Grandma came a year later, and she worked as a nanny for a very short while before they were married. But she was a nanny over in England, and she came from Worsted, where the Worsted cloth was made in that parish.
Worsted wool. Yeah. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Okay. And then,
my folks,
right.
my dad was born just outside of B, on a little cottage on the farm, and my mother was born in Missouri, and they moved to Seward here in 1903, I think it was. And in my dad's family, he was the oldest of 9 children. In my mother's family, she was one of the younger ones of 11. And she being German and he being English, it was a mixed marriage.
Isn't that wonderful? Now, they were a little after the Homesteading Act, weren't they? What brought them to Seward? Did you ever remember?
My grandmother's sister was Mrs. Robert Jerry, Senior.
Okay.
And you had to have either a relative or a job. And so he took the name of William Watts to come, even though his name was really William Flaherty, and he came with one of Grandma's brothers.
Okay.
But he came.
Because your family's name was Flowerday, right?
Flowerday.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then, Tony, then let's see, where were you born?
I was born right here in Seward, right in a little house that my folks were real proud of, down right next to the Burlington Railroad tracks, which is now part of Hughes Brothers storage lot.
Okay. Oh, that's cool.
West
Okay.
Moffett Street.
West Moffett Street. And then where were your parents from?
Well, my dad was a first generation Czech. His parents had both come over from what is now the Czech Republic.
Okay.
They came over as young people and settled up in the Linwood area. And then they moved, when Dad was 6 years old, they moved to a farm north of Garland.
Okay.
And bought a farm there, and that was the family farm that was in the family for many years.
Okay. Where was your mom from?
And Mother was born right here in Seward, and her dad was involved in moving houses, building, and so they lived in quite a few different places here in Seward. Many of the houses still exist here that they lived in, and Mother's told us stories about many of them. But her dad had rather a mixed English, Scottish, German background, And her mother was a first generation Irish person. Her mother and dad both had come over from Ireland.
You know, I'm running into a lot of this, a lot of Scotch-Irish, and a lot of English, and then German and Czech in here too, isn't there?
The grandmother used to say from the north of Ireland.
Oh, wonderful. That's wonderful. Then I'm gonna go back. We're gonna go back again, and we'll go ladies first, because can you elaborate just a little bit, like where you grew up? These are some of the things that we've got what your folks did for a living, and it was farming.
My folks farmed, and it was a corn, wheat, oats type of farming.
Grain.
With cattle and horses and hogs, and they did their own butchering. And they would also butcher for the neighbors if they
If
it had a sick cow, they would get my dad to come and help. He was a director of the school board as well.
Was there a train line was there a railroad by your farm?
Yes,
when
there
you
was.
grew up?
And the bums would come off of the track and come, and there was another house, another neighbor, just less than a block from the track, but we were about a fourth of a mile. And one day I said to my dad, why do they come here when it's closer to go to Humps's? And he said, because the last bum that came to our house and got food put sticks and a stone to point to come this way to get something to eat.
Oh.
And so they knew where they could go.
The best house to go to.
And my mother would usually fry 2 eggs, and they'd have homemade bread, because they baked bread at least every other day. And they had all the home canning in the basement, in the cellar. But they would fix quite a meal, and black coffee. My mother loved the blacker the better. And those bums really liked that black coffee.
They knew where to go. They
had their marking along this.
The reason that I didn't realize that is before that, maybe 30 years, 40 years before that, you didn't really raise hogs or cattle to market, because there was no way to get them out of here, was there? But then did you put them on a train? Did you ever market hogs or cattle?
Not on the train. My cousin's husband had a trucking business, and he would truck them to Omaha, to the stockyards.
Okay.
And but we had our own meat. My dad cured it in a little smokehouse right beside the driveway, and we had everything we needed. My mom would get 500 chickens every spring, and we always had raised ducks and geese, and we had a business of dressed chickens and cream from the milking the cows, and we usually had anywhere from 15 to 25 cows. And that was hand milking, because we had no electricity. And
incredibly hard work. Every day was a hard day.
One time I was sick, and my mother had been to town and bought a dozen oranges for me, hoping it would help me feel better. And then she went out to milk. And when she came back, she was looking for the oranges to give to everybody. I said, oh, I ate them all. I had eaten the whole dozen oranges.
Let's certainly hope. I bet you had to go do the milking again the next night.
No, I didn't. I was spoiled. I was the baby of the family.
Can you remember what might have been your favorite meal? What was
yes.
wonderful to eat?
A fried chicken, because we always had those spring fryers.
Yes.
And sweet corn on the cob. And sliced tomatoes out of the garden, cucumbers.
Yes.
It was your typical farmer meal, and every meal, both noon meal and evening meal, we had meat. And sometimes we'd have meat for breakfast if we had bacon.
And did sometimes, now, of course, my childhood was in the early 50s. Did you take lunch out to the field sometimes?
Yes, twice a day, in the morning and in the afternoon. We took lunch to the field, and that was just part of farm life. And
how did you keep when you butchered chickens, how did you have a refrigerator? Did you have an ice house? How did?
We did not have any electricity because the
There.
farmers didn't have electricity at that time.
That's right.
But my dad dug a cave, and he did that with a team of horses and a scraper.
I
And
have a
dug
scraper
that
sitting in my
cave,
yard right now.
and he dug a cistern as well.
Okay.
And so it was quite a job, but he was a very ambitious person, very proud.
But did they can that chicken?
Oh no, we didn't can it. We just dressed it as we ate it. But we had customers in town. Some Saturdays we'd have 25 dressed chickens to deliver to our customers.
There you go.
And the cream from the milking, my dad turned the separator, and Tony always laughs at me because my dad would have to get up out of sick bed to turn that separator because nobody else could suit my mother that was turned the right way so that the spoon would stand up in that cream when it got cold.
There we go.
And the ladies used that for bridge and for anything fancy in town. Why they used that.
Yeah, of course. I remember that too. I wish that I couldn't remember, but when you had fried chicken, you went out and you did them in the morning
Right,
and you cleaned them.
I learned how to chop their head off finally, but I just hated that. But I could chop their head off on the chopping block with the axe. But then they would flop around until
You
they,
can chase them around the yard.
yeah, and my mother would mark them, she'd weigh them, and if it was a 4-pound chicken, it would have a red checkered ribbon on the leg. If it was a 3.5-pound chicken that somebody didn't want quite so big a fryer, then that would maybe be a blue ribbon or whatever.
And about what years were these?
Well, those would have been about 30, 35 to 45, I suppose.
So the Depression,
Oh, the Depression.
did it affect you
Oh,
terribly out
definitely.
there?
That was that cream and chickens, that was our cash flow.
That's what kept you going.
Yeah, that's what kept us going. We found records in my mother's house where when they gave to the church, and my grandparents couldn't afford anything, so my folks put in $1 for them, and they put in $1 for my aunt and uncle who couldn't afford anything to keep their membership in the church. And that just brought tears to my eyes.
Yes. It was a totally different lifestyle, wasn't it? Priorities were different.
My brother always says, when we went to Sunday school, he and I each had 3 pennies. My older brother had a nickel, and my sister had a nickel, and my aunt, who made her home with us, she'd get a quarter.
Wow.
It was wow.
What church?
The UCC church now. It was the evangelical church at that time.
Okay.
And it's then merged and it became the United Church of Christ.
There we go.
It was evangelical reform first, and then it became
Okay.
United Church of Christ.
And then we'll go back to Tony, and we're going to do that kind of all over again. What's your folks do for a living? And you know, I forgot to ask here too, and maybe where did you go to school? But first off, what did your folks do for a living?
Well, Dad, of course, grew up on the farm out there north of Garland. And when he and Mother, by the time of their getting acquainted, they got acquainted at a dance in Garland. And Mother, at that time, Grandpa Walker had bought a farm 4 miles south of Garland, just south of the Garland corner on Highway 34, just over the hill. And the Verona farm was 4 miles north of Garland. So during the courting period, why, Dad would even ride a horse down there and talk about how that horse would single foot all the way those 8 miles home at night. But that's...
So what do you mean when you say single foot?
Oh, it's a particular gait
Okay.
that horses are trained to do.
Okay.
But then, after the folks got married, they bought well, first of all, they rented a little house here in town, and then they bought this little house down by the railroad tracks where I was born. And they would have bought that in about, they got married in 20, so they would have bought that in about 22. And Vivian was born in 23, and then I was born in 25. And so it was in that little house.
I didn't tell you.
And we lived there then until I started to kindergarten here in Seward. I went through kindergarten. And at that time, the kindergarten was in a little house just south of where the old high school, you know, the building that's still standing,
Right.
the 1919 high school.
And then I do remember that beautiful building right south of it was the
Yeah.
elementary school.
And that elementary school, Dad even helped build that.
Oh.
But it opened in January of 1932. So I went through kindergarten here and my first part of first grade. And we opened that new school right after Christmas of 1932. And then in February of 32, we moved out onto the old Verona farm.
Okay.
And
Okay. Now, what surprises me is Seward's always been pretty up and coming with education, and to have kindergarten. Because in northeast Nebraska, we didn't get, Mama didn't let us have kindergarten. No, I always tease.
We didn't have kindergarten either in our school.
We didn't have kindergarten
No.
out there.
oh, we even had a rhythm band. And
Oh, my star!
we wore capes and stuff. And
Oh.
played sticks and triangles.
Uh-huh. Oh, wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. And see, that just bears out that Seward's always thought highly of a proper education, didn't it?
We had never heard of snow days until our kids were in school
Uh-huh.
then, because you went to school, if it was a blizzard, you went to school, whatever. But you went to school every day.
There, there.
The big boys, if they didn't show up for school, it was to help their dad in the field.
There was a reason, it was understood, yeah. Describe a day in elementary school.
Well, I really enjoyed school here in Seward. You know, I had good buddies. Don Seidel was one of my best friends, and his dad had the jewelry store, and we'd stop in on the way home from school and play with some of the toys that he had there in the store.
Okay. I remember the Seidels, and I don't know if I really remember it, if I remember pictures of it.
And I had several good friends, even some of the neighbor boys, some of the alley boys lived down there near us, and so I had good friends, and then we moved out to the farm, and here I was a town kid moving out amongst all of these country kids, you know, that wore overalls and stuff to school, and I was kind of an outsider because they always made fun of this town kid. And so it took me a while. It wasn't until Art Schaefer and I got started playing baseball together that I began to be accepted as one of them when I could play baseball with them.
If you can play baseball well enough, you might make the grade.
Right.
We're going to take a little aside here, and we're going to come up ahead about 50, 60 years. And let's just document that you and your sons have, now what have you managed to do in the United States?
Well, when we talk about baseball, I guess going back, the first baseball game, first Major League Baseball game I ever saw was in the fall of 1948. Ed Pollock and my brother Don and I drove to Chicago, and we got to see the White Sox play the Yankees and the Cubs play the Cardinals. And it was just a 2-day trip. But that got me started. And then during the years that we were in Washington, D.C., of course, we had the Washington Senators there in the American League. And we saw a lot of games. But as I traveled, I also tried to pick up a game wherever I could. And so consequently, I ended up being able to see all 30 of the Major League Baseball parks. And I have kept up that record of seeing all of the current ones. And I've seen close to 20 of those that are no longer in existence. But as recently as a year ago, about now, our one son and his son took me to Miami, and I got to see the new park down there. So I'm current.
You are
I'm
current.
current with all 30 of them.
Wonderful. Let's see. Now we'll go back again. Tell me what, we'll go back in time again, but we just had to get that little aside in there. What do you remember eating for supper that was your most favorite thing?
Mashed potatoes and creamed peas.
Oh, I know. Oh, wonderful. There's nothing like fresh cream peas out of the garden in the spring, is there?
We ate a lot of potatoes. You know, I guess it was interesting as Elaine and I have rationalized our growing up and our eating habits. They were meat eaters. We weren't particularly. We ate a lot of vegetables. And we had meat, but we never had meat more than once a day.
Yeah.
Where with Flaherty's, if they didn't have meat twice a day and sometimes bacon for breakfast, why, they didn't have a meal.
They might not make it through the day, huh?
Right.
Right.
But we ate a lot of rhubarb and asparagus and all of that sort of thing.
But we even ate roast ducks and roast geese, and we sold those for the holidays
There
to our
was
customers.
a lot more, folks did eat a lot more ducks and geese, didn't they, before? Now, then, let's see here, now we have to move ahead here, or we're gonna be here till Thursday. When did you two get together? How did you meet?
Well, it was a rather short story, actually. I guess first of all, I have to tell you that I had a girlfriend when I was a senior in high school.
Oh dear, okay.
And her folks decided about the time I graduated from high school that she shouldn't go with me anymore because I wasn't a Missouri Synod Lutheran.
There you go.
And it broke my heart to the point that I just swore I was never going to go through that again.
Okay.
And so I didn't even look at a girl for probably 3 or 4 years. And somewhere along the line, my younger brother got acquainted with some of the Seward girls, and I tagged along. And at about that same time, Elaine's brother Dale started building some terraces with a little old Ford tractor and a disc in the front of it out in our neighborhood, and he got acquainted with Don Armstrong. Well, I don't know whether you know much about the Armstrongs, but Don was in my high school graduating class,
You
and
might have to fill this in here.
we
just a
ran
little.
around together, and we were to dance here in Seward, I guess,
In Dwight.
in Dwight. And Dale had gotten acquainted with Don, and Don was always the best looking guy in the crowd. And so Dale brought Elaine over to get acquainted with Don and to see if Don would dance with her, because she had just had her, what, about 15th, 16th birthday.
Not 15.
And Don didn't like to dance, and he wasn't gonna dance with her. So I did.
There
So
you
I
go.
volunteered.
You stepped up. You stepped up. Oh.
And that was the beginning of the story.
And most of the young girls around that were taking a shine to my brother thought I was my brother's girlfriend because we danced together all the time at the dances. And
There
when I
was a-
started to high school, that changed.
Oh. There was a lot of that. That was the norm, wasn't it? To go to a Saturday night dance.
Well, the Saturday night here was the veterans, the VFW dance. The
Okay.
B was the Sunday night dance at the B ballroom, and every other Sunday night was the dance at Dwight.
Oh, okay.
So you-
Everybody had a little dance hall, didn't they?
Well, and everybody went.
Everybody went. That was the entertainment. Can you remember one of the favorite songs right in there?
Well, we had polka bands, and then we had modern music.
Okay.
So a lot of the bands would even play both, you know, but of course when they played the polka music, why, everybody got up and polka. And
Exactly. Modern music, what was that? Was that
That
the
was
big band?
big band music. Mhm.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Cool. So you folks were married what year?
49,
In 49.
June of 49.
And tell me, what was the current event? What was going on right then?
Well, first of all, I almost have to inject this, that the year before we were married, we'd gone together for a year or two, and Elaine knew that I was a farm boy out there, but during the winter I had been to Omaha one winter and worked in the packing house, and I had gone to an NYA school down in Bellevue, and so during the wintertime I could get out and do something else. And I'd come to Hughes Brothers to see about getting a job, and they didn't need anybody at that time. But Elaine heard about the county agent where she worked. The fellow who was the head of the Soil Conservation Service, Jim Struve, came up and mentioned that he was looking for some part-time help that
And
spring.
did I know any young boys that were looking for work?
Oh, wonderful.
So that's how I got started working for the Soil Conservation Service.
Because you had a very long and a very illustrious career with
Right.
soil conservation.
But it just was a coincidence that not only did I end up marrying Elaine, but she was the one that helped me get my life
It
sorted.
was meant to be. It was meant to be. So you got married in 1949, and then, did you live in Seward, or?
We lived in the Maltby apartment, which was right next to the
Markshausen.
Markshausen house that just was
that they
taken
just
down.
took down?
And the morning that we were gonna leave on our honeymoon, we knew we needed to get up and get out of town because we'd have somebody chasing us or capturing us or something, you know, it was
Chivalry.
that era.
Okay.
And so what were we blessed with? But Monsky left his.
Stan Monsky.
Stan Notsky,
Stan
okay.
Monsky left his window open and his alarm clock was right there by the window. And
Oh.
that woke us up, and so we got up, hustled around and got out of town.
Before anybody caught you, because it was the custom.
It
They
was.
would come and, wasn't it called chivalry? When
Well, they had chased us around the night before.
That was enough, yeah.
That was enough, but we knew very well that
And,
we
and
had
where,
to get
where
out
were
of
you,
town
where did
early.
you go on your honeymoon?
We went to California.
My stars.
We left the money at home that we needed to operate on, but we went to California anyway.
And then you came back and you settled in Seward for a short while, or?
Yeah, I was working for the county extension agent,
Uh-huh.
and Tony was working for the Soil Conservation
Okay.
Service.
And then, but then, didn't you relocate to the East Coast there
Well,
after a while?
we lived in Seward here for 10 years
Okay,
after we were married, and that's where we had our four kids. Four kids were
Okay.
born here. And then my job in the Soil Conservation Service, it was really a little bit like the military as far as you had officers and you had enlisted people.
okay,
And so we had what was called conservation technicians and also professional people. And I was a non-professional technician, but I had an opportunity to work as an engineering technician, which is a notch up.
okay.
And I got involved in building watershed dams back in the late 50s. And then in order to continue that, we moved to Lincoln, where I could work in the upper salt watershed as well
We
as
could drive back to Seward to work.
Oh, there we go, there we go.
A
And-
township.
When we were studying the Ridge Road, which is up by Garland, and there again, I didn't know, what are people talking about, what's the Ridge Road? And it is a beautiful, beautiful little spot, all 3 miles of it. But Tony, then why don't you tell the story of that dam? And it got located there, and it worked so hard on it, and then it never did really function real well, did it?
well,
I would have to bring this up, wouldn't I?
yes, I did have the pleasure of not only laying it out, but being the construction supervisor for it. But what happened as far as it not working real well is that some years after it was built, they began to notice how the water wouldn't stay up to the level that it was designed to. And before dams were built like that, they always had geologic surveys, but they would take a boring about every 20 feet or so across the center line of the dam, and somewhere along the line, they missed a limestone ledge where the water was draining through. And so 25 years after that dam was built, they had to let a contract to Bill Hartman to go back and dig it all out and pack that back in. And so it's worked very well ever since then.
Well, and it really worked out well for Bill because Bill ran a business.
Sure.
It was called Greenhorn Limestone
Yeah.
Quarry. Is that right?
Yeah, Bill not only knew about the limestone, but he also knew about packing